Thank, thank you so much. And I'm just going to bring up my presentation.
I didn't do a good job of introducing you except using your name as a sort of joke. And so, would you mind to saying who you are and where you're from?
Absolutely. So I'm Ava Lucky, and I work for a Positive Education Program, PEP, in the Cleveland area. And I'm really happy to be here. I was sharing with my small group that even though I talk for a living, I had some nerves about being here for a couple of different reasons. I have a type A personality. I'm a planner. I need to know where I'm going, who's going to be there when I get there, what do they look like, and what are they going to be talking about. So this is a new group for me. But my small breakout reassured me that I'd knock it out the park and that they are just hungry for information. And I certainly have that to offer. So thank you for having me. So I, again, work for PEP. My official role is Regional Master Trainer. I'm an infant and early childhood mental health consultant. I'm newer to PEP. I'm just coming up on my first year there. But although I'm new to PEP, I'm no stranger to early care and education. Next year, I'll be celebrating 30 years in this wonderful field. Children are my business, and I love working with the birth to 8 population. I love supporting parents, and I love supporting caregivers and teachers. So I actually wrote this training about 3 years, 2 years ago. The pandemic was 3 years ago. So I wrote this training about 2 years ago because I just knew that the ECE field just needed a way just to kind of pull all of the trauma and the, circumstances around the pandemic together and just have a conversation about it. And so this training was born. It really is a 2.5-hour training that I had the task of modifying to 90 minutes a couple of weeks ago when I presented at the Trauma Informed Summit, and then talk about pressure. Then I really had to further condense it for today's presentation. But I am going to do my best to kind of give you a nice summary of this topic. So we know that the beginning of 2020 was a time that we'll never forget, right? It, unfolded the unimaginable. And now we're at 3 years post of those unprecedented pandemic disruptions. And even though it was 3 years ago, it looks like the pandemic is over, right? Stadiums are open, concerts are, up and running, crowds are everywhere. You won't find a mask. You're likely not to find a mask in sight. And when folks do have masks, you sometimes just assume either they have a compromised medical condition or they're paranoid, right? But even as the pandemic recedes, our children are still paying a heavy price. So I want to kind of explore that this morning. So just really quickly, when I developed this training, I wanted to kind of talk about the standards for social and emotional development, specifically for children ages 3 to 8 years old, and children that were 3 to 8 years old 3 years ago. So I want to think about them where they were during the pandemic and where they are 3 years later. I want to kind of talk about the devastating impact that COVID-19 placed on the social, emotional, cognitive, and lived experiences, and just the overall well-being of children ages 3 to 8 years old. And then I want to appreciate the challenges, but we can talk about disruptions and what happened, but I'm all about solutions and strategies. So if we can kind of just think about ways we can support children and families and build their resilience after they had this major disruption in both their educative, but just in their lived experiences. I think that we all can agree that it certainly takes a village to promote infant and early childhood mental health. And infant and early childhood mental health really is at the center of all educational, health, and policy matters that we advocate for. So, we have to make sure that children's mental health is protected so that they can learn and so that they can thrive. And so we're having all these trending conversations about mental health and emotional well-being. Well, what does that really look like? In order for us to really help children and families build that strong mental health foundation, we have to ask ourselves, what do we do when that foundation breaks? and infant and early childhood mental health consultation, and a lot of the initiatives and services that we have available in the state of Ohio are certainly responsive to that. And I'll kind of cover that at the end of my presentation. So when we think about environments and experiences, we know that every human begins this journey towards becoming emotionally healthy and socially skilled as soon as our senses are able to register the sound of our mother's voice in her womb. So, we know that, humans come equipped with this strong drive to connect with other people. And when that, connection is disrupted, it's going to have an impact. So, when we think about how children were, separated from their peers, and they were, placed in a place where they didn't have those typical experiences, those typical learning experiences, some things were compromised and some things were affected. And we know that, rich environments and experiences, developmentally appropriate, high quality experiences are going to foster positive social interactions. They are going to help children to develop this sense of community and care for one another. Be able to, have positive regard for individual differences. Those are the things that we learn in early care and education. I always remember this poem that I used to use when I worked in EC programs, and it says, "Everything I need to know in life to be successful, I learned in kindergarten." So just think about when children didn't have that, when they were disrupted. A child's ability to, develop initiative and, really be able to develop personal responsibility for their own actions. Those are things that we learn in that early learning setting. Developing conflict resolution, emotional self-regulation, and also community rules, being able to kind of know, what is normal. Those are things that we learn from those early learning experiences. So we in early care and education, we always lean on the early learning and development standards. And so I really am not going to cover all the standards, of course, because I'm talking about socialization here. So we're really just going to kind of look at social and emotional development standards. And these are those standards that, help children to develop self-awareness and expression of emotion, develop their own personal self-concept, learn how to, comfort themselves, and self-comforting leads to self-regulation, having that sense of competence, being able to learn a skill, practice it, and achieve it. Relationship attachment with caring adults, their caregivers, as well as those peer interactions, and children's ability to develop empathy. Those are the standards for social and emotional development. That's what we want to see in an early learning program. So those peer interactions and relationships, I am, particularly concerned about in regards to the pandemic and the disruption. When children were not in traditional care environments, if they may have been at home with mom or dad and not in social settings, then they didn't have the opportunity to develop these skills. If they were, with grandma or older siblings and not in this, rich developmental program, they may not have been able to have an opportunity to practice things like simple back and forth interaction with peers, and interacting with peers in more complex pretend play. Because what we do in early care and education settings is we create an environment in which children are able to learn and practice those skills. So the pandemic definitely created a environment in which children were removed from the traditional or typical early learning environment. So what do we know about kids pre-pandemic? Well, just some data, some facts. We knew that before the pandemic, about 1 in 6 children aged 2 to 8 years had a mental, behavioral, or developmental disorder. So about 1 in 6. And we know that about 13 to 20% of children and youth had some sort of behavioral or developmental concern at any given time. And it was even higher for children that were 16 and older. About 37 to 39% of children in this age group had a confirmed or diagnosed behavioral or emotional disorder by the age of 16. We also know that approximately 18% of youth were diagnosed with some type of developmental disability. About 9.5% of children were diagnosed with ADHD. 7.4% were identified as having some type of behavior problem, generalized behavioral problem. 7.1% with anxiety, and about 2.5% of children were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So then we had the pandemic, right? And then we had to reckon with the pandemic, and we had to adapt. And we know that COVID-19, took all prisoners. So it didn't matter whether you were white, it just didn't matter, Black, Indigenous, anyone was affected. Everyone was affected. We've all been impacted in some way. And so when we think about what that impact did to the birth to 8 population, or the age 3 to 8 population during the pandemic, we know that it disrupted the children's sense of normalcy. So normalcy and routines, missing significant life events, not able to experience things like, community celebrations, birthday parties, and things of that nature were definitely compromised. Children having fear of their safety and their security. What the world looked like around them, being fearful. Children being introduced to things like illness and death at an age that is a little earlier than we normally would kind of expose children to those kind of harsh facts. The break in continuity of healthcare. So children not being able to get medical care or mental health care, and certainly missing education and childcare were definitely very large negative effects of the pandemic. So class attendance, and we're talking about anywhere from childcare programs all the way through our K-12 classrooms, even though we're specifically looking at our younger kiddos here. But we knew that the pandemic was going to affect education. But how bad? How bad was it? For more than 168 million children globally, they missed some form of classroom-based instruction for about, anywhere from 3 months to a year. And, it was an education crisis, and we're still experiencing the impact of that today. On early care and education settings, I could talk, for hours about the impact that it had on children based on each age group and early care environment versus a K-12 environment. But if I just specifically look at early care and education, the impact on children were these missed learning opportunities. Children of color and low income were definitely at greater risk of experiencing these educational setbacks. And just the stress on parents and caregivers who had to figure it out when childcare programs were closed, or may have been working at home themselves and had to provide care for their children. And then we had this increased unfocused screen time for children for many different reasons. Screen time was used in, remote learning and hybrid learning. And I feel like screen time, went completely berserk because we were using it. It had a purpose, but then it was misused because now we had very young children that had access to screens at an age when we typically in research would support that screen time for our youngest children is unhealthy, yet screens were put into the hands of our youngest citizens. And then the impact that it had on educators was when programs closed, there was loss of income for childcare programs. And then when the pandemic, allowances allowed some programs to open back up, then you had these elevated expenses, the price increase for just operating a child care program, food to PPE and all of that. And there were very challenging working conditions, lack of staff. A lot of staff didn't come back because they were afraid to come back. They were fearful for their own health. And so we found the programs that did, if they were able to open back up, they were not able to open back up and operate as they were operating before the pandemic. And of course, COVID definitely elevated the safety risks for not only our teachers, but also for children, as those cases, infection rates were going through the roof. So we do know that throughout the school year of the pandemic, which was the end of the school year for 2020, about 1 to 3 million children never even enrolled, or they never logged in. So we had these missing children that were not accounted for. And what ended up happening, those children were promoted to the next grade. Even high school seniors, my son was a 2020 high school graduate. So he was in high school 2019 to 2020. And those children were just, they didn't have to, pass the standardized tests, and they didn't have to achieve a certain, mark in order to be, promoted on, or to receive all of their points for graduation. They were kind of just moved along. And so we find that there was this missing population of students that were, unaccounted for, but they were able to just move forward. So what did this do? This impact definitely, we're seeing that there's a report that school performance and children's performance is the worst than it was back in 1969 when we started to collect data on school performance. And it's not just poor kids in urban areas, even though the pandemic certainly hit disadvantaged children the hardest, but it was all children all over America. And so there's been like this dramatic reduction in performance on ELA, so those, English language arts, and in math scores. Students on average were 5 months behind in mathematics. They were 4 months behind in reading, and the data is still coming in to kind of give us a idea of exactly how bad it is for children. And, the remote learning, children were not, there's no way that they can be successful learning behind a computer screen, especially when we're talking about, kindergarten, first grade, second grade students that are expected to perform behind a Chromebook. And then we know that the pandemic widened that pre-existing opportunity and achievement gap, hit historically disadvantaged students the hardest. Of course, African-American schools ended the 2020 school year with about 6 months of unfinished learning. Okay. The COVID, we're seeing research that's coming in that is, giving us some data on child IQ, and could the pandemic have an impairment on the cognitive development of children? And so those studies, we're, just really starting to really get some information that kind of, give us a baseline to see where children actually are. So the implications on children's social and emotional development, is that children were impaired. Mental health problems among children and, young children, adolescents was and is still being reported by parents. And, their major hospital systems are reporting that about 50%, a 50% increase of children that are being treated in just the ER for things like suicidal ideations and anxiety and panic attacks. So the implications are, it was a disruption to social and emotional development. children are reporting, or their caregivers are reporting, that their children are feeling isolated, and that their children are having a hard time building relationships with other children or other trusting adults. So the bottom line is children are struggling, and we got to figure out, how do we kind of address this? What is it that we need to do? We definitely need to make sure that we're leaning into paying attention to our children. And this acronym piece is just is a way for us to remember some things that we can think about as we are working with young people, and things that we need to be thinking about as we are determining whether or not this child may need some support, some additional supports, especially around anxiety and stress. So are we looking at things like physiological symptoms? Is their irritability different for them, based on what we normally would see from this child? Does this child express fears or worries? Are there any changes in a child's sleep patterns? Is there any elevation or decline in the child's energy level? So again, just kind of knowing what's normal for that child and paying attention to that to see if maybe there may be something that's going on that needs to be addressed. And then social interaction changes. I've haven't done my own research, but I have worked with early learning programs and parents who have reported that there definitely is social interaction changes, that their children are not interested in being social, playing outside and, being engaged in activities that they once were interested in. We are seeing that the masks are coming off, but COVID hasn't went away. So we need to really think about, these areas of change and how we can support children to make sure that their social and emotional health is being supported. Have we gotten back to normal? Not quite. Even though the playgrounds are back open, we are seeing that a lot of extracurricular programs are not operating to capacity the way that they once were. A lot of it is because of staffing and space. So we see that programs are not able to take in the same amount of children that they once were. We know that play is the number one way that children process what's going on around them. So what do we do for children? We want to make sure that they have opportunities for play, and play is going to address the concerns or the deficits, like the lack of socialization, normalcy, and routines. Play is a way to kind of treat that. Not necessarily play therapy, but play is therapeutic in and of itself. And so we want to make sure that children have an opportunity to connect with other children and have both play that is child initiated, as well as play that we design for them to help to foster those social and emotional needs. We know that play is important and what it does. I probably don't have to remind you that it promotes social and emotional development. Children are learning how to communicate and express feelings. This is preparing them and helping them to get ready to learn and refocus their attention and energy. And it really can help to impact stress, trauma, grief, especially from something like the COVID-19 pandemic. Different type of play is encouraged in response to children who may be anxious or have experienced grief. So imaginative play, that pretend play, superhero play is great. It enables children to better understand reality. And it helps children to approach something that might be frightening to them in a way that's more understandable for them. Social determinants of health, just really quickly, just kind of looking at this data here. And more than 10 million children lived in poverty, pre-pandemic. These are some things that we saw. And these statistics, definitely have been exacerbated since the pandemic. And again, there is data that is coming in on things like, how the pandemic has further disrupted education, how it's increased the poverty and the poverty statistics. So we're just really seeing a lot of this coming in, how COVID impacted homelessness and families that are reporting homelessness and food insecurity and all of that. So we're just kind of really learning about all of these reports and exactly how bad it actually is. When we look at the social determinants of health, this is something that we really need to think about in regards to how COVID further, really marginalize groups of people that already were low socioeconomic status and, their access to, equitable healthcare and things like COVID testing and mental health services, and what the pandemic what it created and the burden that it created on a family's financial stability. Chronic toxic stress. We know that the pandemic certainly created a lot of anxiety and stress. So when we think about chronic toxic stress, we're thinking about a child's, their vulnerability, their overreactivity and hypersensitivity to possible threats. And we know that, the brain is pattern seeking. So if a child is in a high stress environment and, that stress alarm is constantly, being engaged, what it does, and it definitely changes, the brain. And so we need to consider that children that have this chronic toxic stress are more vulnerable to mental health issues and physical illness, and it certainly compromises their immune system. So we want to ask ourselves, will these pandemic babies ever catch up? So our kiddos that were 3 to 8 back in 2020, will they ever catch up? I believe that they can, and there's some things that we can do.
Hey, Ava, we are out of time.
We're out of time? Okay. Well, I would be happy to.
It's like a cliffhanger, and we might have to have you back because this was excellent information, but we do need to move on to our case.
Okay, well, wonderful, but I am here, so I will stop my share, and I'm sure that Kiara and the team will share my contact information if you are interested in finding out more.
Thank you so much.